Welcome, welcome. We'll get started in just a few minutes. You should have on your table a flyer that says sign in. There's a QR code, so if you would please click on that QR code and sign in so that we can get attendance for the event. The other one on your table, the other flyer on your table is evaluation. Wait until the end to do that one, but please do sign in. And like I said, we'll get started in just a few minutes. Alrighty, welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for another installment of our Looking Back series. Today we are looking back 25 years, which doesn't seem like very long, to the 2000 presidential election. My name is Sarah Reed. I'll be moderating our panel on this election today. To my left is Professor James Hathcock, who teaches history at the Northeast campus. To his left is Professor Adam Ramsey, who teaches government here at Northeast. And to his left is Amber Meyer, who teaches speech here at Northeast. So thank you again for coming. And I'm just going to give a little context on that 2000 election. Oops, there we go. For decades, the standard operating procedure for election night in the television era, which only began in 1952, to the present, of course, has been that television network news agencies wait until polls close in a state and then use in-depth study of past voting patterns along with partial counts and exit polls to determine as soon as possible which side will claim the state's electoral votes. In this way, they have been able to successfully predict the winners of presidential elections early enough to send the vast majority of the American public to bed at a decent hour, knowing who the next president would be. They have been helped by some pretty massive landslide elections over the years, as you see on this slide. Here are some of those landslide elections. 1952, you're not going to see that up here, but 1952, Eisenhower won over Adlai Stevenson, 442 electoral college votes to 89. In 1956, Eisenhower again, over Stevenson again, this time 457 to 73. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson over Barry Goldwater, 486 electoral votes to 52. In 1972, Richard Nixon, this was before Watergate, Richard Nixon over McGovern, 520 to 17. In 1980, Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter, 489 to 49. In 1984, Reagan again over Walter Mondale, 525 to 13. And in 1988, George H.W. Bush over Michael Dukakis, 426 electoral votes to 111. Whoops, wrong button, sorry about that. There were a few in there that were close. In 1960, for example, John F. Kennedy went to sleep on election night without knowing for certain that he had won. NBC News and other major news outlets did not officially project him as the winner until 7 o'clock the next morning. In 1976, Jimmy Carter was not declared the winner over then President Gerald Ford until 3:30 a.m. on the East Coast. But no election has ever taken as long or had quite as many twists and turns to determine the winner as the 2000 election. The presidential election of 2000, oops, there we go. The president, oh my goodness, I didn't realize. Okay, there we go. The presidential election of 2000 featured two fresh candidates. The sitting president, William Jefferson Bill Clinton, was precluded from running again because of the 22nd Amendment and term limits. The Democrats selected Clinton's vice president, Albert Arnold Gore Jr., as their candidate pretty easily. He won every single primary contest over the other candidate, former New Jersey Senator and former New York Knick, Bill Bradley. Gore chose for his running mate, Senator Joe Lieberman from Connecticut. The Republicans nominated George Walker Bush, governor of Texas, son of former President George H.W. Bush, and brother of Jeb Bush, who was the governor of Florida. He faced slightly more competition from, mainly, Senator John McCain of Arizona, but had it wrapped up by Super Tuesday. He selected as his running mate Dick Cheney, former White House Chief of Staff under President Gerald Ford and former Secretary of Defense under President George H.W. Bush. Bill Clinton's sex scandal and subsequent impeachment cast a shadow over the general election campaign. The Bush-Cheney ticket repeatedly denounced the scandals and promised to restore honor and dignity to the White House, a strategy that had worked so well for Carter in 1976. Meanwhile, Gore worked so hard to avoid talking about Clinton's bad behavior that he did not take enough credit for the great economy. Instead, Gore was seen as boring and somewhat pompous, while Bush was viewed as a regular guy who you could go and have a beer with. On Election Day, Tuesday, November 7th, 2000, the polls showed an extremely close presidential race. That was affirmed as voting closed across the nation. For the rest of the account of the 2000 presidential election, all times will be given in Central Standard Time because that's easy. At 6:50 p.m., less than an hour after polls closed in Florida, the major networks declared Al Gore to be the winner in Florida, based on exit polling and partial counts. Its 25 electoral votes were moved to Gore's column. At 8:54 p.m., the networks retracted Florida from Gore's column and determined that it was too close to call. At 1:17 a.m., the networks announced that Bush had opened an insurmountable lead. They projected that he would win Florida's 25 electoral votes and George W. Bush would be next president of the United States. They reported that Al Gore had called Bush shortly after midnight to concede the election. And no, that is not Al Gore calling Bush, but I had to put that up there because, yes, phones were bricks in the 90s, so had to put that up there. At 2:30 a.m., Al Gore called George W. Bush again and retracted his concession. It was not an overly friendly conversation. At 2:58 p.m., the networks retracted Florida from George W. Bush. At 5:22 a.m., the networks project Al Gore as the winner in Wisconsin, giving him a 259 to 246 electoral vote lead with 33 votes, including Florida's 25, still undecided. Whoever won Florida, therefore, would win the election. On November 8th, because fewer than 600 votes separated the two candidates, Florida state election law required a mandatory statewide machine recount. On November 9th, Gore's legal team requested a hand count of presidential ballots in Democratic-friendly counties. By Friday, November 10th, the machine recount was complete and George W. Bush's lead was narrowed to 327 votes out of around 6 million votes cast. On November 11th, Bush's legal team sued in federal court to stop manual recounts in the state. This set off a flurry of lawsuits by both Bush and Gore teams at various levels of county, state, and federal courts. Dozens of lawsuits, countersuits, and appeals were filed. Here's a quick overview of the main issues. First of all, there were the butterfly ballots. It was called that because it consisted of a booklet that opened like a butterfly, with two columns of candidate names separated by the middle column where the voter punched the perforated square on the ballot corresponding to the candidate they wanted to vote for, creating a hole that would be read by a vote counting machine. There were several issues with this type of ballot. For example, if the ballot was not fed into the booklet correctly, the arrows with the candidate names did not line up correctly with the appropriate perforated hole, causing a misvote. This could be either an overvote, where there was more than one hole punched for a given office, or an undervote, where no hole was punched for a given office. This issue was blamed for some potential Gore votes being cast for independent Pat Buchanan instead. In a race as close as Florida was, every vote was important. Another problem was that some holes were not completely punched out of the ballots, so the machine would not read them correctly. The perforated part that was supposed to be punched out was called a chad, so there were hanging door chads. I'm not even making this up. I'm going to go through a whole list of chads. Hanging door chads, the perforation was hanging by one corner. Swinging door chads, the perforation was hanging by two corners. Tri-chads, the perforation was hanging by three. Dimpled chads, it's one of my favorites. The perforation was dimpled, but not pierced. And finally, the pregnant chad. There was some form of mark on the perforation, but it was neither dimpled nor pierced. So the issue was that there was no consistent standards to determine how to count a ballot that had chads. Do you count it as a valid vote as long as there is some evidence that a voter tried to cast a vote? Do you only count it if 3 of the 4 corners are knocked out? Something in between? No consistent standard was developed. Whoops. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Gore's team wanted hand recounts of every undervoted ballot in the state of Florida. Bush's team wanted the recounts to end by the deadline of 4 p.m. on November 14th with no exceptions. Every time Gore's group would win an extension, Bush's lawyers would appeal the decision, and so it was this countless court case back and forth. On November 22nd, a group of Republican staffers dressed in corporate attire of suits and ties, hence the name the Brooks Brothers Riot, because of Brooks Brothers suits, led a demonstration to disrupt the recount efforts in Miami-Dade County. The demonstration turned violent, and according to the New York Times, several people were trampled, punched, or kicked when protesters tried to rush the doors outside the office of the Miami-Dade Supervisor of Elections. Sheriff's deputies eventually restored order. However, within 2 hours after the event, the canvassing board unanimously voted to shut down the count, in part due to perceptions that the process was not open or fair, and in part because the court-mandated deadline had become impossible to meet due to the interference. On December 8, 2000, the Florida Supreme Court ordered manual recounts in counties that had not already retabulated undervotes for the presidential election. Bush immediately filed an emergency application in the United States Supreme Court, asking it to pause the state Supreme Court's order. The U.S. Supreme Court granted his request and also agreed to review the merits of the case. On December 12, 2000, the court issued an unsigned opinion reversing the Florida Supreme Court's order. In a 7-2 ruling, a majority of the court held that the recount process ordered by the state Supreme Court violated the United States Constitution's 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, because counting standards were not consistent across counties. In a narrower 5-4 ruling, a majority of the court ruled that a fair statewide recount could not be performed in time to meet the December 18th deadline for certifying the state's electors. After this decision, Florida's recounts were stopped and its electoral votes went to Bush, handing him the presidency. By winning Florida, George W. Bush narrowly defeated Al Gore by 271 electoral votes to 266, just one more than the required 270 to win a presidential election. Gore, however, won the popular vote by over 500,000 votes, the first time the popular vote winner did not coincide with the electoral vote winner since the election of 1888, although it has happened quite a few times since then. On December 13th, 2000, Al Gore delivered a televised concession speech in which he accepted the finality of the outcome of the contest. This speech was an important part of the process to unite the nation behind a new president. In the end, the 2000 election was one of the closest and most controversial in American history. Its long-term effects include a questioning of the usefulness of the Electoral College and the role of the courts in deciding elections. Ultimately, Bush v. Gore should serve as a reminder that a few hundred votes here or there can alter the course of history, and that the democratic process requires constant vigilance and participation. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. My first question is for Professor Hathcock. Was the election of 2000 unique? Have there been other elections similar to it in terms of electoral confusion and chaos?
All right, well, thank you, Sarah. Okay, so show of hands, who was alive in 2000? Okay.
I think we can count them on 2 hands.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I remember staying up really late that night. I think I stayed up till about 3:34 in the morning. And the very next day, I had a graduate class. It was a Civil War class with Dr. Richard Lowe at UNT. And that very next morning, we were asking him questions like, this is crazy. Has anything like this ever happened before? And like immediately, he went to 1876 and said, that's, yeah. There he is. Okay. And he said, yeah, actually, there has been something like this, and it happened like 120-something years before. So I want to talk just a little bit about the election of 1876. I always tell my students it's probably the craziest election in American history, although 1824 might have something to say about that as well. But this one in 1876 is pretty wild. I'm going to stand up. Sorry, I'm more of a stander. Okay, so this is in an age of something called Reconstruction. How many of you have ever heard of Reconstruction in your history or government classes? Okay, so a lot of you understand Reconstruction. Okay, so this is post-Civil War. The Democratic Party is sort of trying to get its legs back together. They're, quote, redeeming the southern states at this time. But if you'll notice, down here in the South in particular, there are 3 states that don't look like the others, right? We're looking here at Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. And of course, Florida is always a problem, right, in these elections. But there were all kinds of charges of corruption and fraud in those 3 key states. Now, at that point in 1876, the Democratic Party controlled most of these southern states. They had redeemed Texas, for example, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. But in these 3 states, the Republicans still held some level of control, whether that was in state courts or in state legislatures or something like that. So after the election is over with, after they're counting the ballots in these 3 key states down here in the South, there are all kinds of charges of corruption and fraud. I remember there was a story coming out of Louisiana where they had ghosts casting votes, like people had been dead for 20 years, and somehow, some way they were casting votes here in 1876. So it was pretty obvious that something was up here in these 3 states where the Republicans still had some level of control. Now, ultimately, Oregon will go for Hayes, but there was also one of its electoral votes was actually being contested as well at the time there in 1876. So you get to, say, December of 1876, and we don't know who our president's going to be. The Democratic Party is filing suits in court. The Republican Party is countering those suits in court. And eventually, at some point, the government decides to create a commission, an electoral commission, to try to look into these charges of corruption, bribery, things like that. It was a panel of 15 people. 5 were from the House, that's the House of Representatives. 5 were from the Senate, and 5 were from the Supreme Court. It was supposed to be a case of one of the members of the Supreme Court was an impartial justice. His last name was Davis, if I remember correctly. So it was kind of a situation where you have 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and then 1 impartial. That's the way it's supposed to play. All right, so to speed things up, because I do go lengthy. Down here in Florida, this commission uncovered that the Republican Party had thrown out 2,000 Democratic votes here in 1876. And once you figure that out, the 2,000 are missing. Hayes only took the state by like 900 votes there in 1876. So it's kind of obvious that something was going on there in Florida. The commission did find, dead people were voting in Louisiana and things like that going on down here. And a lot of that fraud was going on in South Carolina at the same time as well. So eventually what this commission had to do was try to sit down and figure out, well, what's true, parse through all this and figure out what do we accept, what do we not accept. And at the end of the day, the commission decided to go with Rutherford B. Hayes in all 3 of these states, and they also gave Hayes the remaining electoral vote up in Oregon. There's a story of when the commission sat down to discuss Oregon and, to vote on who would take the state. One of the guys on the commission was sick. He couldn't get out of bed. So they decided to go to the guy's house because it was that important and, there was kind of a deadline. So they held the vote around this guy's bed while he was in bed sick and decided to give Oregon over to Hayes as well. But at the end of the day, Rutherford B. Hayes goes on to take this. You can see there by 1 electoral vote, That'll be the edge that gets him the presidency here in 1876. And there was a case of like that one guy who was supposed to be impartial, the one Supreme Court judge, he bowed out. He had an offer to become a senator in Illinois. He decided to step away from the commission. So they asked another Supreme Court justice to step in his place, and this guy was a diehard Republican all the way. And like every time they voted, it was an 8-7 split, with the Republicans getting 8, the Democrats getting 7. So even within the commission itself, this was a very tight election as to which way these states should go. But when it's all said and done, they're going to get together and form something called the Compromise of 1877. That Compromise of 1877 is a big part of why Reconstruction comes to an end here in the United States. And with that, the Democrats agreed that Rutherford B. Hayes can go on to be a very forgettable one-term president of the United States. And in exchange for all that, the Democrats get an end to Reconstruction. They also got money spent to build dams and levees down in the South after the Civil War. And in the aftermath of all that, I got to get my dates right here. In 1887, the Congress actually passed something called the Election Count Act. And it essentially said that the courts really shouldn't have anything to do with figuring out who won the electors or the electoral college part. It said that only the Congress should determine which slates of electors are true and should be taken and things like that. And the last thing I have here is a quote from a senator at the time, Mr. Ingalls. He said, quote, "The Electoral Commission of 1877 was a contrivance that will never be repeated in our politics. It was a device that was favored by each party in the belief that it would cheat the other, and it resulted in defrauding both." So yes, that 2000 election is not unique. There had been something like it before. The election of 1876 has a lot of parallels with what happened there in 2000. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. So the election may not have been unique in the sense of chaos and confusion, but my next question, which is for Professor Ramsey, how did the Electoral College map look heading into that election? What were the swing states, and why did it all come down to Florida? Again, apparently.
Okay, well, where Professor Hathcock gives you the kind of historical context, I'm going to spin it forward and give us the kind of present context. Let's do maybe back one. Yeah, this one. So this is kind of the lay of the land heading into the 2000 election, which if you paid much attention to the 2024 election, it's not hugely different, right? A lot of the states that were red in 2000 are still red today, and those that were blue in 2000 are still blue today. The big difference you're going to notice, though, is that there's a lot more swing states. I coded this map on the left, the campaign map, as all the states that would end up with a less than 10% margin of victory. So the blue and the red states were all won by more than 10%. The gold states there were won by less than 10%. Now, just to put that in a little bit of context, that's 24 states up there that were won by less than 10% of the vote, which means almost half the states were competitive. Compare that to the most recent election, only 15 states were really competitive, where the winner won by less than 10% of the vote. So we've got a much more competitive map across the board, especially in a handful of states. It wasn't just Florida that was crazy close. The percentages, because the absolute numbers always confuse me, so I always put them in percentage based. Florida's difference that we've heard about already was 0.009%. So that's what 300 votes out of 6 million is 0.009%. Not less than a tenth, less than 100th of a difference in percentage points. New Mexico was also less than 1%. It was 0.06% difference in the vote tally there. So that was also super close, a few hundred out of millions. Oregon, Iowa, Wisconsin, all of those also less than 0.5% of a vote difference between the two candidates. So while Florida does get tons of the attention, and rightly so, it wasn't just there that it was crazy close, and you had recounts and lawsuits and things of that nature. So I would say that's the maybe one big thing to keep in mind about the 2000 election in comparison to maybe the last one or two that we've had. In terms of which states go which direction, a lot of similarities to what we still see now, but most states were much closer across the board. Even the not-so-competitive states back then were still pretty competitive. So it was a wide-open race, which contributed to I think, the tension and the unpredictability of it. So yeah, and why it all came down to Florida, well, just kind of as the numbers indicate, because it was the super closest. Everybody else was essentially able to work out confidently their numbers, even if they were very close. Florida's, as you heard, and you hadn't heard the half of it yet, it got, really into the weeds as to what votes should count, which votes shouldn't, should we recount, how long, all these kinds of questions just unfolded over weeks. And so that's, kind of the sense we got earlier.
All right, thank you for that.
You don't have to.
So I mentioned this in the context, the build-up to the 2000 election, but James, could you give us a little bit more information on this? How did the scandal involving President Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, and I do have a picture of this. Hold on, there it is. There. How did that scandal influence this election in 2000?
All right, thanks, Sarah. So I like being employed. I'm not going to go into the really nasty details of what happened here. Paychecks are good. I got a daughter in college that I have to pay for. So, but like being alive back in the late 1990s, the economy was amazing. Like there were jobs aplenty. I remember I made really mad stacks of cash working at Best Buy. I had a great discount where I could buy all kinds of things. The late 90s were a great time to be alive, and I'm sorry that a vast majority of you did not get to experience that. Bill Clinton did create a really good economy. Now, that wrecked his presidency, the Monica Lewinsky affair, whatever you want to call it. So it does affect this election in the sense that Al Gore could have run on that really great economy. He could have tied himself to Bill Clinton's successes. He could have told the American voter, look, this is just an extension, a continuation of what Bill Clinton's done to this point. But instead, because of the Monica Gate or Monica Lewinsky affair, whatever you want to call it, he had to, in a sense, distance from President Clinton. So he had to kind of go it on his own, and I think that was very good what you said, that he kind of looked like a boring candidate once he distanced himself from Bill Clinton. So yeah, I think it did affect him terribly in that way. But also it really helps George Bush because he can come in and say, hey, look, I'm here to clean things up. He's talked about restoring dignity and honor to the White House, to kind of get the country past seedy relationships like this. So I think the scandal absolutely had an impact on this election, and I can't help but think that it really could have tipped the thing more towards Al Gore had this scandal not been there. I think it absolutely hurt Gore in this campaign.
Okay. All right, my next question is for Professor Meyer, and this is an interesting one because we are definitely seeing this still to the present day. The 2000 election unfolded alongside 24-hour news networks, right? Yeah, we still have this. Early digital media as well. How did the evolving media landscape influence the rhetorical strategies candidates used? And how has that shaped how campaigns now frame messages for different audiences?
So I'm going to come at this from certainly not a historical or a governmental focus. Instead, my field of research has always been on communication strategies, and I really love persuasion. And also, I went and studied education, because why not? So there's some things that we need to think about before we can even begin to analyze. The educational system in America was changing in the last part of the 20th century. As the traditional literature that students would read used to be all based in classical Greek texts, Shakespearean language. But in the 80s, there was a popular shift in education to instead grab pieces of literature from more modern authors and on more modern topics. If you've ever tried to read literature that it was even written in the 1930s, the language they use to write their books and articles is much different than what we use in casual conversation. What happened was, for Americans, the general literacy rate, which is sort of how we measure progress in a society, is, are your adults literate? And there we define literacy as, are you able to read and write applications? Can you apply for jobs? Can you do your taxes? things that adults do on an everyday basis. But by the 90s, the ability for Americans to read, first, long text had greatly diminished, and our ability to read analytical texts greatly diminished. So what this meant for the election was a shift that began in the 90s with the advent of the internet, changed how we got news. So prior to that, let's think about what television was. There was no streaming services, right? So you had 3 broadcast channels, ABC, NBC, CBS. Then in the late 1980s, CNN started as a little cable show, like, hey, we'll bring you all the news all the time. And they were the only players in the game, but not a lot of people watched it. And then in 96, Fox News had their own news show and MSNBC jumped in. So by the time the 2000 election had hit, people had stopped reading newspapers for their political analysis. In prior campaigns, candidate A argued against candidate B, typically on policy issues. What do we do about the national debt? What do we do about the military? What do we do about immigration? And then you would see political differences. But as we lost our ability to analyze long passages of text, then our news reliance was completely on the sound bites of the 24-hour circus that is the media. And as advertising shifted from traditional print media forms to online forms, now there was pressure for the media to really capture those audiences. Because now there were, as more cable companies came out there's a lot of people competing for your eyeballs. How do they get you to pay attention? Well, they're going to show you things that are shocking. So now we just want political candidates. We want to play the gotcha game with them. So we ask, a reporter asks a question and someone says, I did not have, and all of Bill Clinton's quotes now become 30-second sound bites. And we stopped, as a country, analyzing the character because no one read anymore. And instead we went to identity politics, where instead of aligning myself with a candidate because I had the same policy views, I now align myself with a candidate because they represent who I am. And that's sort of where we jumped onto things, is that it shifted with all the news cycles that were out there. And in the hours, the 2000 election is what made Fox News. Prior to then, Fox News had about, the percentage of viewership was low. And by 2002, Fox News had taken over CNN as a more popular place to get your news because they put themselves out there like, we're giving you constant updates. And that's what people had begun to crave. And so we shifted how we sought information to the point that today campaigns no longer even try and give us detailed policy analyses.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
My next question back to Adam, why was the Florida vote count disputed? What were the technical issues or controversies? And I know it's complex. Break it down for us.
Okay, well, we're going to start simple and then I will dabble in the complexities. I can only dabble because I've been reading and studying for weeks to get ready for this, and the more you read, the more confusing it becomes. Because it's multiple different courts, multiple different levels, multiple different lawsuits, multiple different issues, and they all get kind of mixed and matched together to where your brain is eventually just mush trying to figure it out. But I think there's one quote that does kind of sum up the whole idea or the whole situation pretty well. It was from an article written at the time, soon after the election was completed. And it basically just comes down to the fact that it was disputed because it was a tie. I mean, it's a statistical tie in every sense of the word. Bush's margin was so small that all the anomalies and oddities that mar the margins of any major election ballooned into major national controversies. In other words, when you're trying to do an election across millions of people, you're going to have some unclear results sometimes. There's going to be some quirky ballots, some mistakes, some errors in counting. Anytime you do anything on a large scale, these things are going to pop up. Normally, they don't make any difference, right? I mean, it changes the outcome by 0.01% here or there, doesn't matter. It only matters in these elections where 0.01% is the difference. So a lot of it really at the end of the day, for all of the nitty-gritty that I'm going to try to take you through here a little bit, and I'm going to lean on Professor Hathcock as well. At the end of the day, it really all comes down to the fact that this was a tie. And whenever you tie, but somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose, somebody's going to get the short end of the stick. I was talking to some folks earlier, and it reminded me of an NFL playoff game a couple years ago where there was a tie, and then the Chiefs won in overtime, but the other team didn't get to have the ball in overtime, so we had to change the rules so that the other team could get the ball in overtime. You had 60 minutes to win the game. You did, right? And so at a certain point, a tie is a tie, and somebody's going to get the short end of the stick. But to get into a little bit of what they were actually arguing over, it goes back to those hanging chads, it goes back to those butterfly ballots. So you kind of had two different tracks of confusion there. There's the butterfly ballots, which I know we saw them up there earlier, but they were confusing to voters. They weren't used in all counties as well. It's only some counties that had those butterfly ballots. So the reason they were confusing is there were like 10 candidates, right? So it was like vote number 1, vote number 2, vote number 3, except the way they were listed on the ballot is it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they were on opposite sides of each other. So in other words, if you started just on the left side with candidate 1, which was, I think, Bush and Cheney, and then wanted to go straight just beneath that one, you might think logically that that was the second choice, right? Number 1 is here, number 2 is there. That was actually number 3. And so, in other words, people were clicking chads or clicking ballots that they didn't intend to click. That's what contributed to some of the hanging chads, the pregnant chads, because some people, started to click, oh, that's the wrong one, and then tried to fix it, right? So some ballots also had double clicked, right? They had chosen 2 candidates on the same ballot. This was noted, by the way, and it caught a lot of attention because that third option, that one that was probably mistakenly chosen by a lot of people, was a third-party candidate from a very conservative party. And yet a lot of those ballots were coming in from a heavily Democratic district. So if you're in a heavily Democratic district and you're going to vote third party, you're probably voting for Nader, not Buchanan. And yet a lot of these mistaken ballots were coming in from Democratic districts, votes for Buchanan instead. So that's where the butterfly ballots were confusing. In terms of the hanging chads and the dimple chads, in the courts, it kind of became a matter of how do we count those? So Florida law had it to where automatic recounts would go in effect based off of machines. So a machine recount would go into effect immediately because the election was so close. The machines struggled with those dimple chads, hanging chads, double votes, like the machines couldn't figure those out. So the Gore camp says we need a hand recount, right? We have to go through them by hand and try to see what did the voters actually intend to do when they voted, rather than have a machine just, spit out some results based off of whatever it decided, because it was confused by the chads. So the Bush camp obviously pushed back against that. They were leader in the clubhouse, and so they didn't want any recount because, well, if you're ahead and there's a recount, you might lose, and that's what you're trying to avoid. So they're trying to stop the recount altogether, or at the very least say, if there's going to be a recount, it needs to be the same standardized system across the entire state, which was not possible. Those of you who've taken really national or state and local government should know every state has its own election system. It's actually even county by county has their own election system. So there was no way to do a standardized, universal, single way of counting all the ballots across all the counties. They didn't have the same ballots. They didn't have the same counting systems. And when Professor Reed walked you through the hanging chad, dimple chad, swinging door chad, different counties, some would count the hanging, some would count the dimpled, some wouldn't, right? And so you had these inconsistencies across counties as to who's counting what, and essentially it ties the courts up in knots, right? We're trying to find a fair resolution. We're trying to do something that's going to be, fairly counting the votes across both sides. But again, when it's this close, what's fair to one is not going to be fair to the other, at least not in their opinion. So, I really don't know how much more of that y'all want to get into, other than to just say, I guess to kind of set up Professor Hathcock, what started as state-level courts trying to sort out state elections eventually works its way up into the U.S. Supreme Court, which is really where the controversy kicks off. So I'll kind of punt at that point and throw it back to Professor Reed. But yeah, I guess the idea is to understand that you've got a contested election. The states are in charge of their elections. Lawsuits are being filed left and right in the Florida courts to try and figure out how to handle this. And then the Supreme Court shows up.
Okay. On that note, James, did Al Gore have a legitimate case for overturning the result in Florida? So going off that Bush v. Gore 2000 case, kind of walk us through that and let us know.
I did not prepare for Bush v. Gore.
Oh,
Okay.
no. Do you want to, Adam, do you want to just kind of give us some Bush v. Gore
I
side?
can answer the next question.
All right,
Yeah.
so we'll do that. Okay, Bush v. Gore, did Gore have a reasonable argument? Again, I'm going to go back to what's going to be my safe harbor, to use a term that came up a lot in this case. It was a close election. It was basically a tie. Of course he had a case, right? Had it been 500 votes ahead for Gore and Bush, Bush would have had a case, right? I mean, when it's that close, 0.009%, weird ballots, everybody's going to have a case. So in terms of the Supreme Court case itself at the U.S. level, Bush v. Gore, essentially what happens here is the Florida Supreme Court, sorry, and there's one thing I got to throw in as well. Okay, so all this is trying to be decided at the state level. The person who's in charge of certifying the state results in Florida is the Secretary of State, and her name is Katherine Harris. She was also the campaign chairwoman for the Bush campaign in Florida. Now, that obviously strikes many of us as an odd conflict of interest. It's not actually that unusual. If you're a national candidate and you want to hire somebody to run your state-level campaign, who better to hire than someone who has recently won a state-level campaign? And so it's not that unusual to hire people like that, but it obviously does present an awkward situation when this kind of thing arises, where the person whose job it is to certify the election results obviously has a favored candidate, right? The person who is paying them, not to mention in their party and so forth. So the Secretary of State says, you counties can recount your vote, but I got to have it by this date. If I don't have it by this date, I'm going to ignore your results. So those counties say, okay, we get together, we start counting. We're not going to get to that deadline. For some of the reasons we heard already, the states or the counties realized, we're not going to meet that deadline. Can we get an extension, please? I'm sure y'all can appreciate asking for an extension sometimes. So the secretary or the county courts or the county elections offices are asking the court for an extension to have more time to count all these ballots. The Florida Supreme Court says, yeah, sure, take an extension, take another week or two, count all the ballots, and count them to the best intent of the voter. What do you think the voter intended? Those were the standards that were given by the Supreme Court of Florida to the county election officers. You have an extra week to recount these votes and count them based off of what you think the voter intended. Now, those are the two things that get challenged at the national level. So Bush sues and says those things aren't fair. The recount shouldn't take place at all because there's a deadline. It's an election law. Maybe votes are still being counted. Too bad. The deadline is the deadline. Enforce the deadline. They also argue that you can't tell the counties to count the votes based off the intent of the voter, for kind of the obvious reason of how are you supposed to figure out what the intent of the voter was. Right. Gets us back into this whole hanging Chad, dimple Chad, multiple votes from what did they mean when they clicked this button? So, after some legal wrangling at the national level, the Supreme Court ultimately argues or decides the recount can't go forward. It has to come to a full stop because to do so would violate the Bush candidacy's equal protection because not all ballots would be counted in the same way. Therefore, it wouldn't be fair to President Bush to count them, county by county in some different way each. Now, the Gore campaign pointed out that's how all the counties are doing it already anyway. We're already counting them differently. So if that's unconstitutional, the whole election is unconstitutional. But, court didn't buy that argument. The other thing they didn't buy was the intent of the voter. Again, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Florida Supreme Court basically made that up or created that, and it's not actually in Florida laws originally. So that Florida's law says there must be a standardized voting, vote count procedure across all the counties, and that if you tell the counties, go based off of intent, they're going to do different things. Some will count the dimple chads, some won't, and so that will be uneven. Now, again, the Gore campaign argued that, hey, voter intent is still a standardized, recommendation or a standardized rule. That people might interpret it differently is on them, so should be able to go forward. But essentially, the U.S. Supreme Court overruled the Florida Supreme Court. And where the Florida Supreme Court had told the counties, you have an extra bit of time and you can count some of these votes that hadn't been counted, the U.S. Supreme Court came in and overruled the Florida Supreme Court on both counts, said no, deadline is the deadline, and you have to count them all the same way, which effectively ended the election. So that's kind of the long and short of Bush v. Gore. We can maybe come back later and talk about the consequences. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, gosh, so complex. So I'm going to turn next to Professor Meyer. So from your perspective as a speech professor, how did the rhetorical styles of Bush and Gore in 2000 signal a break from the campaign language of the 1980s and 1990s? What lasting trends began there that we still see in presidential communication today?
The 2000 election shifted the way all of us will experience elections going forward. So do you remember your English teachers in high school and here, and perhaps your philosophy professor talks about, the ancient Greek way of persuasion. You use ethos, your ethics and personality, your logos. Can you put two thoughts together and have any logic? And your pathos. Do you love them? That is very simplistic. Please don't hurt me. Okay, so it used to be that candidates, for long periods of time up through 80s and 90s, they crafted messages based on logic. Because again, if you're going to read a very in-depth article that may start on page 1 and then go on to several more pages, then you can really take the time to build an argument using logic. That shifted. So there were a couple problems that some of the candidates had, is that Gore, who was the vice president, right? And oftentimes, we saw that with Reagan had his 2 terms, and then the first Bush got the next term. So people kind of assumed it's like, oh, cool. Clinton had his 2 terms, now his heir apparent will get in there. But Gore had a challenging issue that Clinton was being raked over the coals for the Monica Lewinsky affair, and therefore he was seen as sort of not having any moral standing. And his opponents decided to preach that, hey, we're the ones that are moral and they're just bad people. So Gore had to figure out a way to shift his message to say, I'm not like him, but I also like him. And so you had to balance the game. And Bush was really effective on this because a lot of the Republican policy issues that they wanted to advance were seen as mean. So there were some thoughts about, hey, we're spending too much on Social Security, we're spending too much on food stamps, we're spending too much on this. And so then the conservative side was being attacked for being evil. Okay, well, they can't do that. So Bush was great. He came up with the idea of, I'm a compassionate conservative. And Bush talks like your Texas neighbor, and he kept peppering his speech with a lot of them, well, them good old boys. And he did that intentionally to make people think, hey, I know that guy. I know somebody just like him. And this was the shift from voting for people because their policies reflected what I valued to voting for him because I see myself in him more so than I see myself in the other candidate. Gore had another challenge, is that he's something of a nerd. He is a total nerd. He's all about research and academics. And we'd gone through a time in America where that was highly valued. But it began to shift. I mentioned that our literacy rates have been declining. And people no longer appreciated having an egghead tell them about all these facts that they didn't feel that they knew very well. And they thought it made them feel stupid. So we have now left viewing that kind of intelligence and now we want more a personable guy we can relate to. So I think as you had mentioned earlier, when Bush is talking about, I'm going to restore dignity and honor, it's completely about the Monica Lewinsky thing. So Gore wanted to try and shift his message as, it's the people versus the powerful. Unfortunately, his message didn't track because people kind of viewed him as part of the powerful. Let's see what else we wanted to have. Oh, their campaigns became really simplistic. Yeah, because people would not take the time and you just wanted memes. We began to get memes in politics. Another interesting thing about this election was the evolution of shows on Comedy Central that were news programs. So The Daily Show is still Comedy Central's most popular show. At the time, during this election, it was run by Jon Stewart as the host. And I always thought it was an interesting bit of statistical analysis. More young people were getting their news off of The Daily Show on Comedy Central than off of any other news platform. Because the three traditional, ABC, NBC, CBS, they were and still are targeted at 50-plus-year-old people. Your grandparents watched those news shows. Young people didn't want to watch those shows anymore, and so they watched Comedy Central. And we got a lot of our news from Comedy Central, which comedy is about fun little sound bites that I can play over and over and talk about tongue-in-cheek. So the way candidates appeal to people has shifted from logic to connection through emotion. And that's still what we're doing in candidates now. And when I can get people to connect with emotion and view this as us versus them, if you feel attacked and threatened that your way of how you think the world ought to work is threatened by those bad people, you're very highly motivated to go to the polls and support your candidate. Much more so than, you know, it would be better if we reduced this tax. That doesn't really motivate, but fear does. And we shifted. Okay, that's what I think about how we sort of jumped ahead. Oh, we were also really tired. I'm sorry, we are so tired. Y'all, whenever, oh gosh, what was it? Like in May, when we started getting political ads for this election that we just had, I was already going like, no, we just finished an election. Why are you getting political ads again? Because once political ad season gets here, that's all you get to see. And so people get tired of having to listen to it all the time. And there are so many more things that capture my attention. I'm just going to take the easy path out. And I'm going to go with, yeah, sure, that one. He's like me. I'll vote for him. Where we landed.
All right.
Thanks again.
Thank you. So, James, for sake of time, I know that you have a class that you've got to run off to. Classes are important. So, for the sake of time, I'm going to couple your next two questions, if that's okay. So, did the questions surrounding the vote count in Florida hurt Bush's ability to effectively govern the nation? Was this cloud that was hanging over his head?
For some. I think the country was very bitterly divided at that point, and I don't know that it's gotten better over the last 25 years. If anything, the divisions have gotten worse. But I do remember on his inaugural event, his car was going down Pennsylvania Avenue, and people were throwing eggs at his car. There was kind of a sense that the election had been stolen by many people in the country. I think at first it was something that made him kind of look like an illegitimate president. But I got to say that with the terrorist attacks of 9/11, a lot of that stuff went out the door. I mean, like, the country just got around the flag and got patriotic, and, you know, he was our commander-in-chief who was going to lead us through this war on terror. So maybe at the start of his presidency you could see that, but I don't know. After 9/11, I think that illegitimacy cloud kind of went away.
Sure.
Yeah.
So in the aftermath of this election, were there any changes in election laws and election technology that went into effect?
Yeah, there was actually a lot of change that came about. The Help America Vote Act was passed that next year, and it basically was trying to get the problem of these hanging chads to go away. The federal government gave a lot of money to states to upgrade their election equipment. Things started to become more about electronic votes, but with a backup paper system, if you will. So yeah, there really was this big move towards more electronic voting and getting away from, what do they call it, the hand lever voting, those machines that were like that, and these paper ballot votes with the hanging chads to try to get those things to go away.
Those were the days though, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Anybody ever voted by paper? I think we
It
all
was a
do.
long time
Okay,
ago.
just a few. Yeah, yeah. It's mostly
Don't believe the
electronic.
chat.
Mostly electronic now. Amber, my next question is for you. So you've noted the shift from policy details to narrative and identity. What does that change mean for voters' ability to evaluate candidates critically and for the health of public discourses?
I'm very concerned. Y'all need to be very concerned. If we just elect people because they're a cool meme, what on earth is our government going to look like? Where are the people who understand policy? And if we don't have that anymore, this election prompted us to begin questioning so many of the traditions. And one of the things that came out of it was facts. Hey, if you don't like the facts, just wait, there's some more coming. And people often struggle to what are the facts when it seems like you're getting two opposite facts sold to you and someone is claiming these are equal. Their opposite is like the other guy's wrong, the other guy's wrong. So how do you know if somebody's a lie? Well, people always, just think about your videos. Hey, do your own research. Do your own research on this. Y'all ever read a full study like original research? It's a nightmare. And I do this professionally. Just reading oh my gosh, there's 5 sections and I've got to get through the literature review. It's very difficult. I guess that probably the last time that you said, oh yeah, I researched this, what we all do is we've seen a couple videos on TikTok and we're calling that research. Because we don't, as a society, now seem to value who's an expert. If we're all experts, then no one is to be believed. And that's what really worries me. Because for generations of humanity, if somebody went to school and really studied it and became an expert in the field, we valued their opinion more. But that shifted. And now we just say, your opinion, your opinion, your opinion, they're all equal. And it's like, okay, but if I'm sick and one of you is a doctor, I need that person's opinion to count more. And we don't do that anymore. And I'm very concerned about identity politics because identity politics produces violence. And when you see the other person, not as someone who disagrees with the policy, but as someone who is morally the opposite of you, then it is easier to demonize them and justify bad behavior. That there were people that threw eggs. Eggs are the least of my concerns now. I hope they're just throwing eggs at this point because it's become more violent. And it's become more violent because now a vote is who I am, not what I believe. And that's worrisome for me from a communication standpoint.
Thank you for that. And the last question, yes. You can clap.
Yay, the last question.
The last question, to wrap it all up, is for Adam. Did this election have any long-term effects on U.S. politics? Can we still see some of its legacy today?
So it's interesting, when I was asked to be on this panel and to ask, to draft some questions to kind of, frame up the discussion, this was just a question. I was like, well, of course you asked this question, right? But I didn't really have any answers in mind for it. It was just a question I thought needed to be answered. And to kind of, call back to something Dr. Hathcock had mentioned, he remembered staying up all night watching the returns and everything. I was 16 at the time, and I didn't care. I was just wrapped up in my video games and whatever I was going to do with my friends on the weekend. I was not interested in politics at all. And so it was interesting then for me to answer this question with that kind of now hindsight, or, with all this knowledge or hopefully expertise I've built up over the years. And when I was first kind of looking at it, my answer was no, and then I kind of drifted to yes before I came back to not really. So the no reasons. So one thing that we also mentioned was confidence in the Supreme Court, right? Because the Supreme Court appeared to sort of intervene in this election. Did that maybe cause some of the decline in confidence or trust that we have in the Supreme Court? Because that's one of the narratives you tend to hear about this election. And it's understandable, because one thing I should have mentioned earlier is when the Supreme Court at the national level made this ruling to end the election and essentially declare Gore the winner, it was made by a 5-4 vote. There were 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court and 4 Democrats, and they voted along party lines. And it was extra noticeable for the reason I kind of mentioned a few minutes ago. Normally, Republicans don't like the federal government telling the states what to do. But in this case, it was the other way around. And to be clear, we're not picking on Republicans here, because Democrats flip themselves around on this issue as well, right? Because they're, again, taking up the opposite positions that they normally do with respect to federal-state balance of power. So with that question, I was, well, did it actually change public opinion in the Supreme Court? And I think I have a slide in here from Gallup polls asking about confidence. Oh, there it was. And there you can see the percentage of Americans who express some confidence in the Supreme Court over the last 50 years. And I've highlighted the area around 2000. Didn't really change much, right? They were pretty much as respected to the extent that they were. I mean, notice here we're hanging around the 50% mark, and that's when it was good. About half the country had some sort of confidence in the Supreme Court. 2000 didn't really seem to have much of an effect there. So yeah, I think maybe the narrative is that, but the data maybe not so much. Obviously, other things have drugged down the Supreme Court's reputation in recent years, but didn't really seem to do much with this election. Again, like we kind of talked about at the start, we didn't really see a radical change in terms of which states were Democrat, which states were Republican. It's still pretty much the same cast of characters now, but here are the yes answers to this election having some long-term impacts. One is just kind of a fun little quirky thing. Before this election, getting back to the point about cable news developing during this time, whenever network news would show you the winner and loser of each state, they were random with the colors they chose. Like Democrats weren't blue and Republicans weren't red. It was mix and match. Different networks would do different things. 2000 is when they locked in Republican is red, Democrat is blue. So kind of just because, and ever since then, that's largely held up. So it was not like a huge deal there, but that's for the, at least media, making it easier for us to follow along what's going on. Instead of going from one network to another and trying to figure out which color is which, it's all just kind of standardized. So that started in this election. Let's see, networks became a little more careful about not calling winners so quickly because it's obviously very embarrassing when you say this person's the winner. Oh, wait, no, they're not. This person is. Oh, wait, we're not sure. So that's not good for news credibility. The 2 other things I would mention, though, in terms of long-term impacts. One was already been alluded to. I don't think it's so much that the election itself necessarily affected American history in a major way, other than had the tie gone slightly differently, we have a different president for 9/11. So that was my political awakening. I was a senior in high school. That was the first time I was like, oh, politics is a thing that matters, because some people out there woke up today and you thought, it's a good idea, flying planes into buildings. And I had to figure out what on earth makes somebody think that's a good idea. And that's kind of how I ended up here today. So be careful about asking yourself questions. But anyway, so that was kind of my political awakening and paying attention to more of these things. And I don't think it can be disputed that American history would have played out much differently with a President Gore instead of a President Bush for 9/11. Most of what happened in Afghanistan probably would have happened no matter what. The Iraq War would not have happened. So, I mean, that's just a simple declarative, would not have happened under President Gore, which would have been a, obviously very different trajectory. Hindsight or changes in history, who knows, but that's one thing that I think was interesting. And the only other thing I'll mention very briefly is going back to Bush v. Gore itself. One of the other ironies or oddities of this Supreme Court ruling is, as you know from those of you who have taken me for national government, The Supreme Court's job is to set the precedents, right? To set the rules that govern the courts, for all time and all place, right? We're going to standardize things when the Supreme Court needs to come in and set a standard. They specifically said in this court case, this is not a precedent. Like, they went out of their way to say this court case and our decision only applies to 2000, and any other situations that come up like this in the future, you judge them based on the particulars of that situation. We are not setting a precedent here. That hasn't stopped later courts or later lawyers or later cases from invoking Bush v. Gore and using it in court cases. So even though the court itself said don't use this as precedent, it has been used as precedent. In one way that has been nipped in the bud, but was sort of a thing there for a bit, there was a thing that came up, what's called the independent state legislature theory, which argues that state legislatures are completely empowered to determine who their electors are for the Electoral College. Now, the traditional reading of that is that state legislatures, along with the other branches of state government, get to set and make election laws. But some interpreted it to mean if people go out and vote and the legislature says, nah, our electors are this person, they can do that, right? That's the sort of more radical interpretation of the independent state legislature theory, which may have, there were some cases where they appeared in the last few years to try and nudge that more to the forefront. The Supreme Court did rule on that in 2023 and said, no, that's not the way we're going to interpret it. We're going to keep it with the traditional way of doing it, where it's not just the state legislature that has control over the elections, it's the other branches of government as well. So that may seem like a small thing, and hopefully now it will become just a footnote in history thing. But I think it's important to note, just as an example of how, especially courts, when they intervene, when they throw in just a little line or a little clause there, it can have reverberating effects. The only one more thing I'll mention is just in terms of the politics itself, and I think I've got another slide here maybe that indicates this. One more forward. Oh, no, so maybe it didn't make the cut. No, it's okay. So what I was going to show was that while, yes, the states in terms of are they more Democratic, are they more Republican, blue or red, that hasn't changed that much over the last 25 years. But what has changed is more at the county level within those states. Where we once had a very purple America, meaning you would have, a few more Democrats in the cities and a few more Republicans in the country, it was still fairly even. It was still, a pretty purplish hue if you mixed it all together. I'm not seeing it in there. It must not have made the cut. But if you actually look now at the same county level, red versus blue, there are no Democrats in the country anymore. They're just gone. And similarly for the Republicans, they're just not there anymore. So, in other words, our elections remain close, they remain competitive. It's just where, Democrats and Republicans used to be kind of competitive everywhere, and all counties kind of drew from, Republican and Democratic voters, there's been much more of a sorting. And essentially your low population rural counties are ruby red, and your big population cities are, dyed in the wool blue. And that's maybe part of also what's contributing to some of the tension, some of the identity politics, some of the divisiveness that we see. Is it's one thing where you have an election in the 2000s and it's super close and it's super competitive, and maybe you're bummed out that your side lost, but some people who voted for the winner, and you trust them, and you can kind of say, well, my guy didn't win, but my uncle voted for that person, so I guess they can't be terrible. When you don't know anybody who voted for the other party, voted for the other candidate, it contributes to this otherizing of them, this in-group, out-group. Well, I voted for the winner. Nobody else I know voted for anybody else, so any other votes to the contrary must be fraudulent, right? Because I don't know anybody who actually voted the other way. So as we are, again, kind of interacting with each other less, sorting ourselves into different groups, and social media, internet does not help with any of that. It's going back to, I'll leave you with, what you've heard already. don't get caught up in emotion. Don't get caught up in the little memes. They are trying to manipulate you. They are trying to prick your emotions to get you to like some people and dislike people. Think with your head, not with your heart. Your heart is for other things. Your head is for the thinking. So when it comes to elections, right now people are mostly trying to appeal to your emotions. You have to guard those cautiously and try to rely on your brains to make decisions and not based on your feelings. Feelings are great, but not for thinking. All right.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so we have just a few minutes for some questions. If anybody in the audience has questions, I'll come around with the microphone. Or Samantha, you want to? That'd be great. Thank you. Any questions? I know it's a lot of information. And it's complex. All right.
Hello. So what I saw was this all directly ties into public education and how education shifted. So
Right, where do we go
How-
from here?
yeah, exactly. So where do we go from here? Do we go back? Do we find a new way forward? How do we find a way to shift from sound bites and smaller segments of information back to, critical thinking and able to read 6 different pages of an analysis and understand that so that we can help the country for the better rather than, oh, I like you, you seem like a cool guy.
We have to have an educated population. It's why governments have put into their constitutions that education is something they must fund. Founding people in the government said, you've got to have educated people or they are easily manipulated. And we've moved away from that. So I'm not sure, what do we do? We're restricted. I think, he had mentioned, hey, I want to keep my job. We've now codified by law what educators can and cannot tell you. So I'm now afraid to speak and educate people with everything I would have said because identity politics make it where people can be easily offended, and we justify being easily offended. So then it just goes to personal responsibility. Please read more. Develop the skill of sustained reading on something other than fanfic, right? Because that's easy, right? That's written at an 8th grade level. I can zoom through that and I feel like I've done great. I've read 3 books, but I didn't. And then make sure that those around you, if somebody says, hey, I saw that, make them prove their sources. We let people off by just saying, I did my own research. Like, no, you didn't. You watched a lady on YouTube who doesn't have any type of knowledge. So force people to defend their position. Let's get into debate, which is different than attack. And we need more of this.
And I'll jump in on that really quickly before I know everybody's got to go, but I'll just give you a couple of idioms that, one from, a great world thinker, is be the change you want to see in the world, right? The Gandhi quote that many people know. So, and I like that because it gives us agency. It's not about waiting around for society to change to get better so our lives get better. You got to kind of claim that agency yourself. I'm a big proponent of that in all aspects of life. You're in control of your life. So be in control of your life. And then similar on that note, as my old pappy used to tell me all the time, your education is what you make of it. So there's good educations to be achieved here, across town, across the state, across the country. What you do with that is up to you. So you can use your education just to get a job and then collect a paycheck and then breeze on through and, do whatever the YouTubes tell you to do. Or you can take that education and deploy it for your own purposes, deploy it for your own goals. So use it in the ways that, you want to see things get better. So if you want to see better critical thinking, do it more yourself, right? And do it in a way that, communicates it to others, brings in others.
Go to school board meetings and demand that you as a taxpayer, we need citizens who can whatever. Make them do that. School districts work for you. Go hold people accountable.
Democracy does work, but it does depend on the people keeping up their end of the bargain,
Yeah.
which is showing up when we open the door, which is what y'all have done here today, which of course we really appreciate. And if I can jump in a couple of plugs, first, especially for my students, make sure to get the sign-in code there to count for your attendance today.
And the evaluation for everyone.
And the evaluation. Tell us how terrible we all did, or great.
I do a good accent,
Yeah.
Y'all can grade
Yes.
me on that.
Yeah, that's true.
although my West Texas landman accent is now solidly there for everyone.
Well, we just missed the 96 election where I talked about in my classes last week. They got to hear my Ross Perot.
Nice, nice.
National debt, y'all, we got to take care of it.
Love it.
So, yeah. And then quick plug for my own event
Yes,
coming
of
up
course.
here in just a couple of minutes. The News Forum every Wednesday over in NACB. I'll be heading over there right now. So if you got a couple extra minutes and
Bonus points.
want to talk about current things, we'll be doing that.
Great way to think critically about what's happening in the world today. Thank you all
Thank you
for
for coming.
coming. Click that evaluation QR code. Have a wonderful rest of your day.